Welcome back to another build video. This time I'm using the Bozeman Frigate, which just came out. I was originally saving up my Zen to buy the Elachi Frigate, and something that I do whenever I plan to buy a ship, I try to think of what kind of value I'm getting for the Zen, especially on a free-to-play account like this one, but I'm starting to not really be able to call it that much anymore because I've accumulated enough Zen to be able to buy a few things from the store, so I'm not sure if that follows the definition free-to-play, but I have spent $0 on it, so I think it still counts. But basically, when you look at a ship, it comes with a trait, a console, sometimes an experimental weapon, and the actual ship itself. And the best ships give you something really good in all three categories. The worst ships maybe only give you one good thing. For example, the Mirror Angle Escort is a great example of a ship that has all three. You get superior area denial, you get cascading subatomic disruptions, which is a great console, you get the graviton implosion charges experimental weapon, and the ship itself isn't that bad either. It's intel and temporal. It's not the best ship, but it's still very, very good, and considering all those other things, it's a great deal, but of course that's a lockbox or bundle ship, so it's fairly expensive. There's plenty of ships where you only really get one good thing out of it. Like some ships have the most optimal bridge officer layout, but a really crappy trait or crappy console, or both. So, you know, on a tighter budget, you want to get stuff that really maximizes that bang for buck. And originally, I was saving up all of the Zen that I could accumulate here, and I'm actually pretty much out of dilithium. Most of the dilithium I converted to get Zen on this account came from my temporal recruit and my Klingon recruit, where I just had a huge surplus of marks, and I just kept converting those marks to dilithium and refining 8,000 a day. I really haven't been playing this character very much to earn dilithium like a regular player would, so I'm pretty tapped out now, but it happens to work out really nicely because the Elachi Frigate is 4,250 Zen when it's on sale. Never buy anything when it's not on sale. But then this Bozeman came out, and then a week later there was a ship sale, 20% off. So I got this for 2,400 Zen, which is basically half the price, or a little over half the price of the Elachi Frigate. And similarly to the Elachi Frigate, it has a great trait, it has a great console, and the ship itself is really good too. In fact, the ship is better than the Elachi Frigate. If I bring up the page here, the Elachi Frigate has a hull modifier of 1 and a shield modifier of 1, and the highest spec seat is a Lieutenant Commander Intel seat. The Bozeman, or in this case the fleet version, you've got 1.265, so higher hull capacity, 1.045, which is higher shield modifier. You have the same impulse speed and only slightly lower turn rate of 13 instead of 15. But you also get a full spec Intel seat and an additional Lieutenant Intel seat as well. The only thing I think that the Elachi Frigate maybe has an advantage on is it has an extra tactical console. So you could slot 4 colony consoles and Lorcas, or 5 colony consoles and Lorcas when it's T6X'd. But the Soyuz, or Bozeman, also has a cloak since it's full Intel specs. So this is a really, really great ship because, again, it's got all three things. It's got a great console, great trait, great ship. So considering the price was a lot less and the trait is still, you know, broken and overpowered, I figured I might as well grab it and use it for a PvP build. And since it's full Intel spec, it also allows me to build a free-to-play Surgical Strikes PvP build, which I couldn't really do before because the only other ship that I could maybe do it on was the Fleet Scryer. I thought about trying to earn some fleet ship modules and do it on like the Eclipse Intel Cruiser or the Phantom or Fate Intel Escort, something like that. But I think this is slightly superior. But I am going to show two different bridge officer layouts. One is Surgical Strikes and one is Beam Overload, and which one works best for you will depend on what other traits you have available and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to go through the build itself. Starting off, I have the Piezo Polaron beam array, the Discovery wide-angle dual beam bank, and 3 Agony Phaser arrays. The reason I'm using Agony Phasers is because they were free from an event last year and I just still had them. If I could re-engineer everything to be crit damage times 4, that would be an improvement here. And the reason I went with arrays as well is that slightly lower turn rate. Since it's a 5-3, it's a little bit easier to stay on target. But I also still have the targeting link dual beam banks that I was using on the Andorian Escort, which was on the same character. And I may swap those in depending on the situation. Those would get me an additional 15 accuracy if I have all 3 slotted, which is pretty nice, especially with Beam Overload. One nice thing about Surgical Strikes is Surgical Strikes already gives you an additional 30 accuracy. So you don't need quite as much accuracy from other sources. The deflector is the Jem'Hadar deflector that grants me some additional perception and stealth detection, along with a large amount of control expertise, which helps me resist being disabled by evade target lock and other control effects. And I have the 3-piece competitive set, the fortified engines, the innervated core for more resistance to control, and the resilient shield array for the additional hull capacity. My rear weapons are the omnidirectional phaser array and the inhibiting phaser array from the Gamma reputation. This one has a chance to disable your target's engines, only for a little bit, but it's better than the trilithium, for example, in this case. And the dark matter quantum torpedo is just kind of here to complete the 2-piece set with the dual beam bank in the front. It doesn't really fire that much, and that's okay. The reason for that is my consoles, I don't have a lot of tactical, so I can only fit a maximum of 4 protomatter consoles. And especially with Surgical Strikes, when you activate Surgical Strikes, it locks out Beam Overload and Cannon Scatter Volley, so you only get 1 chance at the healing from these consoles. So I wanted to fit as many as I possibly could, as opposed to running 3 and then putting the Lorca's console instead, which would get me some additional crit and shield penetration, but I really don't think it's worth it. I'd rather be alive than have a tiny bit more crit. My engineering consoles is a Pax Triburnium, hull image refractors for the temporary hull, hostile acquisition for the accuracy and the hold against enemies. I'm also using enhanced induction coils. This gives me a huge boost to weapon, engine, and auxiliary power. This one I got for free by creating a KDF recruit, so that's an easy one. And then the last one is the Tachyon Net Drones, which is the console that comes on the Bozeman. It gives me a little bit of passive crit chance, severity, and perception, all really good things for PvP. And the active creates this sort of bubble grid pattern thing that reveals cloaked ships and gives them a pretty large negative damage resistance rating. The best thing about this console is it also prevents your enemies from activating Intel Team. But it doesn't move with them or follow them or anything, so most people, if you activate this without any thought, they're just going to fly away from it and then they're totally safe. However, if you activate it on someone who's already stuck or held, or maybe instead of one of these other consoles you'd put on parasitic ice, and you get them locked down in parasitic ice and then hit them with the net drones right afterwards, you could prevent them from activating Intel Team while they're stuck for a few seconds and use that opportunity to get a few big hits in. So that's why I have this one here. Of course, you could use any of the other staples that I mentioned before, like Voth Phase Decoy or the Tachyon Detection Field. Any of those are really great budget options. My science consoles are all basically emergency consoles. I have the Warp Burst Capacitor from the Tier 3 Constellation, the Fluidic Phase Decoupler from the Exchange, which is super cheap, and the Molecular Phase Inversion Field, which came from that Tier 4 Romulan Warbird, another great emergency button to hit when you're in trouble. And as I said before, all the tactical consoles are colony consoles. That's to try to maximize the highest amount of temporary hull and healing that I can get, especially with the way the ship is configured. Now, my specializations are command as primary for boost morale, even though evade target lock has been fixed so that it's resisted. Boost morale is still really useful because you can use it to help out a teammate if you watch their buff bars, or if you just have a lot of debuffs on you all at once. It clears all of them instantly, so it's just a really great button to have. And the extra 15% maximum hull is also a pretty big plus. The Miracle Worker is my secondary spec, and that gets me a little bit of resistance when using heals, which is all the time. Chance for a critical heal, but that's not crazy useful here. But the Leak Protection and Seal the Deck is pretty nice. It clears damage over time effects, makes you immune to subsystem power drains. It's just really good. But a nice alternative would be you could run Strategist and get some additional incoming healing, which is always good to have. Or maybe Intelligence for the extra resistances and stealth and perception. Or maybe even Pilot for rock and roll. I've talked about these before. There's really a lot of side grades for your secondary spec. Just tons of options. I mean, even if you set temporal as primary, then you get the continuity thing. I haven't finished out all these specs yet because I don't have a ton of time to run patrols and stuff like that and grind this. But once I get those all figured out, then I'll try a couple of other ones. But I have all these already unlocked on my main account. And Command Miracle Worker is just sort of a good standard starting point, and then you can sort of modify it from there. Moving on to traits, my personal traits, I have Give Your All, which dodges 20% of incoming damage. Smuggler's Luck, when I lose a shield facing, I get an immunity to control debuffs as well as extra defense for 10 seconds. Pseudo Submission, which placates enemies who have been targeted. That's just a nice way to prevent yourself from being targeted for too long. Intelligence Agent Attaché recharges my captain abilities. In this case, I'm a science captain, so I can get my sensor scan and subnuke off faster. I have Fleet Coordinator here for additional damage. Fresh from R&R, which improves the minimum cooldowns of my team abilities. For example, Intel Team I can use every 10 seconds, assuming it comes off cooldown that quickly, which it doesn't on this particular build, but it does on the Beam Overload variant, so I'll kind of show that. And the Reconstructive Radiation, this clears damage over time effects every 5 seconds, as well as provides a pretty decent heal, which is especially useful on this build. Self-Modulating Fire, which helps with shield penetration. Redirected Armor Plating, which gives you an instant 30 damage resistance rating anytime you take damage from the sides. There's no lockout or anything on this, so even if you're in a really compromising position, this trait is basically always up, so it's just a good option to have. And then the last one, I have Beam Training for additional beam damage. I'm just trying to maximize the damage potential I can get, but if I find myself dying a lot, I can swap that out for something else like Redundant Antimatter Containment, or maybe something like Adaptive Defense or Bulkhead Technician. There's tons of options there. In my Starship Traits, I have the Bozeman trait, the Active Temporal Surge. I did a whole video on this, and I notice here on the tooltip it says the ability has a minimum time, and the untargetability effect has 80% lower duration in PvP. Sadly, that is not true. You are untargetable for 10 seconds at all times, regardless of what map you're on. It doesn't matter if it's PvP or PvE or whatever. It's always 10 seconds. I think this is stupid. All they have to do is change it to be, instead of untargetable, just change it to be X amount of stealth for 10 seconds, and a ship with high perception could counter you, a ship with low perception can't, and that's seems fair to me because NPCs have really, really low perception. So in PvE, if you change this to stealth, it would be the same. So why do it this way? I mean, we could have a game where both PvP and PvE work, and all it takes is a little bit of thought. But anyway, it does grant 100% critical chance, as well as an increase to flight speed and turn rate. And the minimum recharge of 40 seconds is pretty absurd, honestly. I hit the 40-second minimum every time on this build, so I'm basically untargetable for 10 seconds every 40 seconds. And the extra crit chance is really, really powerful, especially with surgical strikes, because surgical strikes give you an additional 80% crit severity. The 30% crit chance we don't really benefit all that much from on this particular setup, or at least while the active is going on, but it's still really good. And then I have improved critical systems. This is from creating a temporal recruit, and I'm pretty much just using this for the 15% crit severity, again, just maximizing the amount of damage I can put out. I have concealed repairs on. This is a nice heal every 45 seconds and an improvement to bridge officer recharge times. This trait is really, really good, and especially with only one activation for the colony consoles, it's a nice way to supplement the healing and stay alive longer. I have superior pedal to the metal now, an additional 30% all bonus damage. Then I'm using Ingenious Tenacity, which comes from the Eisenberg class from the Winter event. When you activate any Specialist Bridge Officer, that's any intel ability, of which I have several, it basically gives you a miniature reverse shield polarity for 6 seconds. So while I'm cycling my abilities, this is up pretty often and helps keep my shields on pretty much all the time. You could drop this and slot something else that increases damage, or maybe something else to, maybe carrier wave shield hacking or overwhelming force, maybe. Oh, well, that only works with beam overload, but you could swap that out for something else if you don't feel that you need the additional survivability. Honored Dead is my last trait, and that one, there's a couple of negatives about this trait, and the reason why I still chose to use it here. The main problem with this trait is the 10,000 damage that you receive, it only applies to damage to your regular ship hull, so not your temporary hull. So when I have a lot of temporary hull stacked up, the Honored Dead trait is basically not working. When I'm reduced to my regular HP pool, then I do start to build resistances from Honored Dead, but by then I'm in a little bit of a compromised position. I don't want to be in my regular HP pool for very long. So that's just something to consider. You could ditch hull image refractors and just keep non-temporary HP, and the Honored Dead would stack faster. But the negative there is anyone that's using damage resistance debuffs against you, there's no barrier to stop that. But it's a really good trait, especially for the cost. I think this was like 20 million or 18 million or something like that. And I didn't have anything else that I felt really increased my resistances enough. Maybe I could use Superior Going the Extra Mile, which would increase my maximum hull for a little bit. But I don't think that's quite enough. 20% extra maximum hull versus 200 damage resist makes Honored Dead a little bit better. So I just want to give a practical example real quick of the way that Honored Dead doesn't work when you have temporary hull. This is the match that I uploaded earlier. And if I skip ahead a little bit, you can actually see how many stacks of Honored Dead I have here. I have 7 stacks of Honored Dead. So that's 70 damage resist, and that's 8 minutes into the match. And by the very end of it, I only have 9 stacks of Honored Dead. And anytime you die, you lose all your stacks. So basically, if you have a lot of temporary hull, this won't stack up all that well for you compared to something that instantly applies like Rhythmic Rumble. And I could run Rhythmic Rumble, but in order to do that, I would have to swap to aux to dampers, and I'm not running aux to dampers. The advantage of Rhythmic Rumble is when you're at speed, it also reduces your weapon power cost as well as increases your damage resistance rating. So not only do you get the large amount of damage resistance, but you also do more damage with your weapons. And I did a lot of extensive testing on that. And surgical strikes does not increase the power cost of firing your weapons. Like, if I look at this weapon, it says -10 weapon power when firing. If I activate surgical strikes and hover over it again, it's still -10 weapon power when firing. However, if I switch to beam overload, it's -15 power. It increases the amount of power consumed. So for beam overload, Rhythmic Rumble plays a more important role in that kind of build. But even in surgical strikes, I basically shot at the same target for 5 minutes, both with Rhythmic Rumble and without. And there is a noticeable amount of increased damage from using Rhythmic Rumble, but you'd have to sacrifice the Aux to Sif here, which I'm using for the Placate. Now, if you don't have the Placate Duty Officer, I highly recommend switching to Aux to Damp and running Rhythmic Rumble, because that'll increase both your resistances and your outgoing damage. Maybe swap out Ingenious Tenacity for Rhythmic Rumble instead and keep Honored Dead, then you could have a really, really high amount of resistance. There's a couple different ways to sort of juggle that. For reputation traits, I have the Advanced Targeting Systems for additional crit severity, Tyler's Duality for additional crit chance, Precision for more crit chance, Viral Engines Overload to slow down and disable the engines of enemies, and Advanced Hull Reinforcement, which provides bonus damage resistance rating. Although if I felt like I was in trouble in a certain fight, I would probably swap out Viral Engines for the Automated Protomatter Conduits trait, this additional heal. Well, regen really, and it only applies to the main HP pool again, but since we only have that single proc, it's really, really useful. Alright, so here are the stations for the Surgical Strikes variant of the build. I have Surgical Strikes 3, so that's our main source of damage. And then I have Evade Target Lock 3. I know Evade Target Lock is sort of fixed on PC in that it disables enemies not as long anymore since they resist it. However, the untargetable time, 8.4 seconds in this case, that is not fixed. So I basically use this as a defensive measure to be untargetable for 8 seconds. Then I have Override Subsystem Safeties 2. This adds an additional 40 to all power levels, but it diminishes over time. And the one major negative is that it knocks a random subsystem offline for 5 seconds at the end. However, since I'm running the enhanced induction coils, if this console is up and active when Override Subsystem Safeties ends, then I don't lose a subsystem. So I'm being a little bit risky by setting it up this way, but it does improve outgoing damage a good bit, and in my testing so far, it hasn't really bit me yet, so that's definitely worth considering. And something really important about this enhanced induction coils, it has a 1 minute cooldown, and it lasts for 30 seconds. But the reason it lasts for 30 seconds is because I have in my skill tree the, where is it? In engineering, I have battery expertise, increases the duration of most battery and device effects by 100%. You pretty much should always have that anyway, regardless of how your build is set up. However, the battery expertise from this spot in the skill tree doubles the duration of enhanced induction coils. So that's why it lasts 30 seconds. If you don't have that point in the skill tree, then it only lasts 15 seconds. So definitely get that skill point if you end up respeccing. And then the last spot in this seat, I have Intelligence Team 1. And that's mainly for the targeting stealth, but kind of nice to also get an additional 250 perception as well. I could swap Intelligence Team 1 to Intel Team 3, and then maybe drop Evade Target Lock down to the first level. That would give me an additional 100 perception in case I'm dealing with more stealth ships. But at this point now, there's so many just flat out untargetable things that it's not maybe as worth it to go all out into perception anymore. My tactical seat, I have Tactical Team 1. That gives me some automatic shield distribution, really nice for survivability. and attack pattern beta 1 that gets me a negative 30 damage resistance rating to any targets I hit. In conjunction with the surgical strikes, it's very, very good. And there's not really much else I would use here. The only thing I could think to do differently maybe is to put TAC team in this last ensign slot and move this engineer over here. And then I could do engineering team 1 and reverse shield polarity maybe. But for right now, I have the ensign seat for engineering team 1. And then this lieutenant commander is my other engineer seat. I have emergency power to engines 1, emergency power to shields 3, and those are cycling. And then auxiliary to structural in the middle, and that is for the placate, like I said before. If you don't have the placate duty officer, then it might be better to slot the aux to dampers instead. Immunity to disable and repel. That's, you know, a smidge better, I think, if you don't have the placate. In the last lieutenant commander seat, I have photonic officer 2, which really helps with those cooldowns. Science team 2 to clear debuffs. And tractor beam 1, which disables enemy intel teams for a short time, but at the speed that I'm moving in this ship, it is really, really difficult to make the tractor beam work. So I may end up swapping this out for Science Team 1, and then switching Science Team 2 for Tractor Beam Repulsors 1, and then using repulsors as a way to get out of parasitic ice. So that's a little alternative there. Now let me switch the loadout to the beam overload version. Still all the same equipment, same traits, same everything. The beam overload variant, the only major difference, the engineering seats are exactly the same, but now the tactical seat is in the lieutenant commander. That's for beam overload 3, cannon scatter volley 1. So there's our 2 activations for the colony consoles, so they are more advantageous for healing, and tactical team 1. The science seat's been moved down, so it's just science team 1 and photonic officer 1. So the cooldowns are not quite as good on this build, the way that it's set up now. If you have the Boimler effect or something like that, then you probably can get away with it that way. And since I'm not using surgical strikes, in the command seat, I'm running aux to structural integrity field 3, and that is for the high amount of damage resistance rating and heal that it gives. However, you could put reverse shield polarity 3 here instead, but at the moment I'm using reverse shield polarity 1 in the lieutenant seat. Another option is some testing I've done with emit unstable warp bubble. I forgot who mentioned this to me, but I appreciate it, whoever you are. Emit unstable warp bubble disables the jellyfish active mode. So if you put this on your ship and you fly really close to a jellyfish that's deployed, activate it, it will knock them out of it. And it has a pretty fast cooldown time, so it's pretty useful. It also prevents people from launching gravity wells, but only for, in this case, rank 3, about 20 seconds, since the duration is halved against players. Yet another example of something that behaves differently in PvP than it does in PvE, even though they said they couldn't do that. And then the rest of the seat, evade target lock 3, again, just for the untargetable time, basically. And then I have 2 copies of Intel Team, 1 and 2, and the reason for that is since I had to drop to Photonic Officer 1 and my cooldowns aren't as good, having 2 copies of Intel Team helps ensure that I am always under the effect of that targeting stealth. Since one of them will always be on cooldown with Photonic Officer 1, I need that second copy to maintain the targeting stealth. Otherwise I could be in trouble. So basically it's just a survivability measure. Now, I did a lot of back-to-back parsing on this. Basically, I took my main PvP build, and I set it to just auto-activate the sequence of abilities that I normally activate, and I set it to fly forward automatically, and then I basically just chased it in this build. And I'll cut up a clip of that and add it in here while I'm talking. But I flew around it, and I attacked it, and I did it with surgical strikes, I did it with beam overload, I did it with Rhythmic Rumble on or off, and I tested a whole bunch of scenarios, and the long story short is, Rhythmic Rumble definitely increases the amount of damage that you can get. However, you lose the placate, like I said before, and Surgical Strikes does do more damage than Beam Overload at the cost of effectively having the amount of healing that you can get. But one other really good thing about surgical strikes is that you don't need as many supporting traits to make it work. Beam overload, and this is just something to consider for your own personal setup, if you have traits like superior area denial or preferential targeting, things that benefit beam overload specifically that can't be used with surgical strikes, beam overload will outperform surgical strikes for you. So surgical strikes, basically, if you don't have as many traits and things as an option, surgical strikes is the higher performer. However, the ceiling is higher for beam overload damage if you have the appropriate traits and configuration. So just something to keep in mind as you're setting up your builds, that, you know, I can set up 1,000 sample builds, but I don't know exactly what gear or traits you already have. So just keep that in mind when you're setting up your build with whatever gear that you already have. Anyway, I'm looking forward to using this build on Friday. I'm going to try it out a little bit. And maybe if I chain the Temporal Surge and Evade Target Lock and Intel teams together right, I should have some pretty good matches, pretty hard to kill. So thanks for watching. Have a good one.